I think we need to go ahead and get started if we can. Thank you and good morning, one and all. Thank you to our colleagues from Florida for hosting us today, and thank you to our panelists, all of you, for joining us today in this very, very important discussion. And also thank you to this great college, Miami Dade College, for having us in your facility. I was just briefed about the college and the enormous contribution you're making to the Miami-Dade community, and I just want to thank you and urge you to continue doing what you have been doing now for many years. The proliferation of misinformation and disinformation is a threat. It is an absolute threat to our democracy. Voters deserve truthful, accurate information about when and how to cast their ballots, and they deserve truthful information about and from those that represent them. Misinformation and disinformation are not only deceitful, but also dangerous. False information about the last election led to a violent, attempted insurrection at our Capitol. To this day, a significant number of Americans believe the lie that the election was stolen. To this day, I will repeat that. To this very day, a significant number of Americans believe the lie that the election was stolen. How sad. Additionally, misinformation and disinformation have been targeted at specific communities, such as Latino and African American communities, to sow division and discourage people from participating in the democratic process. It is therefore our duty to ensure voters have all the necessary, accurate information that they need to cast their ballots and to do so with confidence, with absolute confidence in our electoral system. And so I look forward to hearing from the panelists who are joining us today and learning more about the spread of misinformation and disinformation, the targeting of these falsehoods at the Latino community, and what we can do at the federal level to combat this. At this time, it is my pleasure to recognize a dear friend and a member of the subcommittee, and we also serve on the Committee on Energy and Commerce together, Mr. Aguilar of California, for such remarks as he shall make. Aguilar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you for your leadership on the subcommittee on elections. Under your tenure, we have gone out into our communities. We have talked about voter suppression. We've talked about the 19 states that continue to pass pieces of legislation that prohibit individuals from voting. But this is an important topic that we also need to address. So I want to thank you for your leadership. Not only I'll have the appropriate time to thank you for your leadership in Congress, but let me just say that to our hosts, we appreciate you opening up your doors and being here for us. And under the chairman's leadership, we're going to continue to talk about every type of voter suppression tactic and how misinformation plays into that. So thank you for doing this, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the House Committee of Administration staff for their efforts and their work, and to our panelists. We very much appreciate you taking the time to be here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
And thank you, Mr. Aguilar, for your remarks, and certainly thank you for your leadership. As we begin our discussion today, I would like to just take a moment to introduce our distinguished panelists. First is a friend who served in the Congress with us. I am from the Deep South, and so I've always had trouble pronouncing her name. And I'm sure today is not going to be any exception, but it's Debbie Mercado Powell. Debbie served in the 116th Congress, representing Florida's 26th Congressional District, and was the first South American-born immigrant ever elected to Congress. Next is Raul Martinez, is the former mayor of the city of Hialeah, and I know I mispronounced that, where he served as mayor for over 20 years. He was also a longtime radio host here in Florida and currently hosts a program on YouTube and Facebook. Next is Andrea Mercado. She is the executive director of Florida Rising. Ms. Mercado is the daughter of South American immigrants and has been working on race, gender, and economic equity for the last 2 decades. Eduardo Gamara is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at Florida International University. He holds a PhD in political science. Amir Patel is the Vice President of Programs at Voto Latino and Latino Anti-Disinformation Lab, where he works on designing and testing anti-disinformation content. Thank you to our panelists today for your willingness to come forward and to share this information with us. Congresswoman, you may now proceed.
Good morning, Representative Butterfield. Thank you so much to the House Admin Committee. Thank you to my dear friends, past colleagues, Representative Aguilar, Representative Soto, Representative Fernandez, and Barragan for being here. I hope our community understands what a gift it is for you to come here, bring your committee to shed light on such an important issue that is threatening our freedoms, our democracy, and the future of our nation. We know that disinformation and misinformation is nothing, excuse me, it's nothing new. But what we have seen over the past decade is that our country has seen a surge of disinformation that at first started by targeting fringe groups, and now we have seen it grown to what seems to be a well-funded and well-coordinated effort that is reaching audiences across print, social, and mainstream media. Especially concerning to me, a Latina immigrant that came here from Ecuador and lives in an incredible community where most of the people in South Florida, about 70% of our residents, are Hispanic, is the rise of disinformation and misinformation that is targeting our Hispanic community. We are seeing a rise of false news that has been spread not only in social media outlets, but as you know, we have seen the rise of the spread of false information through WhatsApp groups. A lot of these messages are coming from our native countries, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Cuba, and then it's spread in an exponentially way that is misleading our community, whether it is on COVID, our elections, and it's posing a threat not only to our public health, but also to democratic norms and institutions. In South Florida specifically, we have seen a rise in the right-wing media ecosystem that has been embracing the lie that in 2020, the election was stolen by the Democrats and that there was election fraud in various states. Things that we hear in a continuous basis are that Democrats are communists. Vaccines are medical manipulations that are only meant to enrich Dr. Fauci and the Democratic establishment. Dr. Fauci is a Nazi. The 2020 election was stolen by the Democrats. These seem to be taglines that you would think are hidden, like I said, in dark webs. But unfortunately, we are seeing this spread and repeated over and over again in mainstream Spanish media, whether on television, radio stations, as well as organic outreach through churches and community centers. As you can understand, the main goal of this effort is to undermine our democratic institutions and the ideals of freedom and justice that is the pillar of our nation here in the United States. This disinformation campaign is designed specifically to sow mistrust, to foster chaos, and to threaten our sense of community and ultimately our institutions. The disinformation targeting our Spanish-speaking communities has gone completely unchecked, and that is the problem on mainstream outlets and digital platforms. While this is problematic, what's most concerning is the fact that this is now shaping and pervading more traditional outlets in South Florida. We have also seen the rise of disinformation, not just here, but also across Texas, along the southern border, in Hispanic communities, in New Mexico, in Arizona, and also in California. This has been coordinated not only now, what it appears to be by media outlets, but it is well coordinated by elected officials in high levels of government, whether in the US Senate, in the US Congress, or local state office. Many of the theories that are flooding social networks like Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram include racist slurs, hate, anti-Semitism, anti-vaccine information, all designed to sow division and shatter public trust in the election process. As we were leading into the 2020 election, and I was seeing the rise of disinformation, nothing was more troubling to me than one day when my mother, who living at home at the time, receiving El Nuevo Herald, came to me and handed me this piece of news inserted in El Nuevo Herald, dated Friday, September 11th, 2020. When I started reading, I realized it was a paid advertising, which was not printed at the time as paid advertising. It appeared to be part of the news, inserted in the newspaper, by Libre, which is a right-wing conservative organization funded primarily by the Koch brothers. If you look at this insert specifically, I will read you some of the things that have been included in this insert in English. What kind of people are these Jews? They're always talking about the Holocaust, but have they already forgotten Kristallnacht, when Nazi thugs rampaged through Jewish shops all over Germany? So do the BLM and Antifa. Only the Nazis didn't steal, they only destroyed. On the back page of this particular insert, you will see information about voting, sowing mistrust in the election system, saying that they mistrust the votes by mail, and so they are going to go personally to the election sites. When I reported this to my staff, and they started investigating, and it was reported in various outlets, including Politico, Washington Post, Miami Herald, and Raul Herald, what we quickly realized is that these inserts had been placed in El Nuevo Herald for over 32 weeks every Friday. The Herald conducted their investigation, and they immediately pulled the contract by Libre. And what was Libre's response? The Herald is guilty of censorship. That was Libre's response. The Herald is guilty of censorship. And I repeat that because that is now a new talking point that is being used by conspiracy theorists, by our elected officials here locally, Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, Senator Marco Rubio, local Spanish media outlets, saying that because we are requesting oversight while respecting freedom of expression, while protecting our First Amendment rights, we are also requesting that there is specific oversight on the disinformation that is inciting violence, sowing mistrust in our electoral system, and putting our communities in danger because of the spread of false news regarding COVID, the vaccines, the virus, and treatment. And so, this is not censorship. We are absolutely on the side of First Amendment rights. We are absolutely on the side of protecting freedom of speech. That is who we are as Democrats. That is what we do in the House of Representatives, or what I used to do when I joined you. But it's important to note, and I repeat it once again for the record, this has absolutely nothing to do with censorship, like Libre stated, like Representative Mario Diaz-Balart has stated on these Spanish radio stations. This is about oversight and protecting our communities from false information.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Next, Mayor Martinez.
Microphone, Mr. Martinez. There you go.
Sorry, I've been out of it so long. Sorry for that. You stated at the beginning that you come from a southern state. Well, I happen to live, and I've been here 61, going to 62 years, of a very southern city. Now you see all the buildings, now you see all the megalopolis and everything that in Miami. Miami was one of the most racist cities in the United States back in the 60s. I was here. I lived it firsthand. I lived the fact that police were throwing the dogs to African Americans. After 5 o'clock, African Americans could not be in this section of town. They had to be in their section, right? I remember the sign, Mr. Chairman, apartments for rent, no dogs, no children, no Cubans. I saw the water coolers for whites only. So I'm not talking about things that I did not live. I've lived it. So I've seen the good, the bad of this area, but I'm now seeing the ugly part. Why do I say that? I am a product of the media. At the age of 20, I started with a newspaper in Hialeah. So I've lived with the media. I've seen people in the radio, and most of the Cuban Americans at the time, and most of the Hispanics or Latinos, as you call it nationally, receive their news from the radio. And so they go to the factories, they put the radio, and we always had individuals that had their own spin, but never to the degree of outright lies. And this is what we're going through. So I appreciate very much Representative Aguilar and all of you for being here. I also thank former Congresswoman Debbie McCarcel-Powell for being here, because it's a problem. It's a problem for democracy. It's democracy, the vital part of our country. At least this is what I believe for 62 years that I've been here. I'm going to give you some examples. I worked for Radio Caracol. And on a Saturday morning, I get a call from Senator Tadeo, and she says, have you listened to your station? Usually on Saturdays, I'm doing things, and I didn't. I said, no. So she sent me part of a program, a paid program by an individual. This was, I'll tell you, this was August 22nd, 2020. And I don't have all the dates, but there's a study, I think that Andrea will mention it, where they're specific, and I think that there are others that you can get, because I don't keep the notes. But I remember that day because I was ashamed of being part of a station that would run a program that was so anti-Afro-American, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, to the point that I called and I said, if this is not stopped and it's not corrected, I'm leaving the station. So they stopped. They didn't play the program anymore. They blamed the salesperson. I accepted it because on Monday, I had a member of the Jewish community clearing it. I had a member of the Muslim community. And I also had a member of the Santeria church, because they were talking about Black Lives Matter in Santeria. So this is something that needs to stop. Then you have on WRUN, Actualidad 1040, not only during the presidential campaign, where Agustin Acosta and Karina Morcas were attacking those that wanted to vote for the then candidate Biden as being anti-Christian. But those people would be vehicles of malevolent forces. These are the same group, and they're quoting them, that kept saying that the Southern Command had forces stationed in Panama and the Dominican Republic to invade Venezuela, which was total right. Moncada, in a brutal racial attack in mid-October 2020, said that the founders of Black Lives Matter movement were practitioners of Santeria, witchcraft, and black magic, that they were being driven by malign forces, that the devil is inside these people. Negative forces vibrating them, she said. They vibrate in the dark. And unfortunate, those who cast their vote for Biden are part of that. Then we have Radio Mambi. As of this morning, this committee was being attacked. This is a communist, whatever they call it. And it's coming from a guy that graduated from the KGB school in Moscow. That's the guy. You see, there's a lot of that we can talk about today. And you know, I've been here, never left Miami. You ask me, I'm going to tell you. During the George Floyd killing, everybody was mourning. Everybody saw the protest that we were having. But here in Miami, the people were peacefully protesting for the killing of a human being. What was being spread in the media? That the people that were the protesters were being paid by Venezuela and by Cuba. No single proof. I took it upon myself to many times call the chief of police at the time, saying, Chief, have you found anything? Absolutely not. But that was what's being spread, that Black Lives Matter is part of this witchcraft, that they take the bloods of little kids and they drink it. On the radio, on our waves, radio stations are not owned by individuals. They're leased. The airwaves are ours. Where's the FCC? Is this Chinatown? Anything that happens we don't look at? No, this is part of America. This is not who we are. And this cannot continue. Now the biggest problem that we have is that when you have those misinformation, now you have members of Congress and the Senate amplifying it.
See if you can wrap it up in about 30 seconds, if you will.
Saying it.
Yes.
And you know what? It's sad. When somebody says it in front of them, they don't clear the issue. They don't say you're incorrect. They're being part of it. The latest one is that they had a press conference with the Colombian business people because they wanted the United States to intervene in the elections of Colombia and take out one particular candidate. That's not who we are. That's not what we should be involved. So I once again appreciate the fact that you're here, and I'll be ready for any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. This time it's Dr. Gamara. Please go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. Gamara is not next.
No, I think I'm.
It's Ms. Mercado.
That's correct.
You are next. Yes.
Good morning, buenos dias. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the members of the House Administration Committee. My name is Andrea Mercado. I'm the Executive Director of Florida Rising, an independent organization focused on expanding democracy and advancing racial equity. It was one of many organizations that worked during the last election to advance democracy, to make sure that everyone's voice was heard. And we witnessed the vicious lies that were spread across the Spanish language media that degraded the public discourse. South Florida is largely made up of first-generation immigrants who themselves fled political violence, and Spanish language media should be a lifeline for native speakers who need to understand the issues that are impacting them and their communities. Yet throughout the 2020 election cycle, many Spanish language media outlets enabled the spread of dangerous misinformation, consistently undermined the election results, downplayed the deadly insurrection, and blamed Black Lives Matter activists and Antifa for the violence at the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. with zero factual evidence. We've been consistent in calling on Spanish language media outlets to uphold a higher standard of journalistic standards and immediately stop amplifying voices that spread white nationalist ideology and extremism that undermines our democracy. In fact, on January 14th, 2021, over 50 Latino leaders across the state signed a letter decrying the fact that while the events at the US Capitol were shocking to many, to us it was the long-expected outcome of the incendiary disinformation and hate-filled rhetoric that's characterized the last few years, and specifically as it relates to the uncontested election results. And because we had heard so much disinformation spread on Spanish language radio and Spanish language media outlets, we actually decided to do a report that really studied during the week of the insurrection from January 6th to January 13th in 2021, listening into 4 Spanish language radio shows on 2 media outlets, specifically Radio Mambí, Nelson Rubio and Rodrigo Duran, En Mi Opinión with Lourdes de Kendall, Ninosca en Mambí with Ninosca Pérez Castellón, and Cada Tarde with Karines Moncada and Agustina Costa on Actualidad Radio. These are by no means the only shows that consistently spread disinformation, but we did see time and time again that some of these shows were of grave concern. In that week alone, we put together a report that documented over 40 instances of disinformation, and the report includes links to the actual program and then we translated it into English. You can find the report at nomasdisinfo.com. To give an example of some of the clips, what was being spread by these radio hosts, Agustina Costa said, thousands of dead people voted, thousands of people in jail voted, thousands of people who were not US citizens voted. I believe in one of those states, Nevada or Arizona, 42,000 people voted more than one time. Again, this is the week of January 6th, after all of those claims of voter fraud had been thoroughly debunked by mainstream journalistic outlets. Nelson Rubio said, whenever Democrats say there was no fraud, there are many weird things. I believe there were violations. I do think it was committed. We have to review the integrity of electoral law. We see Lourdes de Kendall and Ninosca Perez the week of January 6th repeating the GOP claims about Pennsylvania's changes in election laws being unconstitutional. They say and even elected officials such as Representative Maria Elvira Salazar saying things on Spanish language radio that we believe they would never say on English language radio at this time. How is it on Ninosca Perez's show, she states on the week of January 6th, how is it possible that in Pennsylvania there are 200,000 more votes on election day than there were on the electoral rolls? That is impossible. Since releasing this report, we have continued to monitor Spanish language radio, and we see that they're consistently continuing to spread disinformation about COVID-19, about vaccinations, continuing to share reports of election fraud that we know that every judge in this country threw out of court. And, our civic discourse should not seek to amplify hateful voices that lead to violent attempts to undermine the will of the people, and instead promote a deeper analysis and center voices that are often neglected or dismissed. We call on the US government to instruct the FCC to build the infrastructure to monitor Spanish language media, which is often overlooked. And is not being held accountable and held to journalistic standards that our democracy requires. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ms. Mercado. At this time, it is really your turn, Dr. Guevara. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Congressmen and Congresswomen, for this opportunity to share with you some of our findings at the university on this very, very significant issue affecting our community. I'm delighted to join such a distinguished panel of policymakers, former policymakers, and of course some of the people that have really been monitoring this very, very difficult issue. The sad reality is that the situation today is the product of a very long period of essentially looking the other way and allowing the problem to grow without gauging the seriousness of trends that have become so evident. Unfortunately, the situation will get much worse before it improves, in large measure because there is no recognition by our leaders that a problem exists. The problem of misinformation in our community has been cast exclusively as a one-sided complaint from a single party whose electoral performance in 2016, 2018, and 2020 declined over the previous years. So it is often cast, as we are listening to the radio this morning, for example, as the cry of a poor loser in a state where the majority rests comfortably in the other party's hands. In my view, mis- and disinformation has had a very direct impact on the way Spanish speakers in South Florida have voted in the immediate past elections. I'm establishing a causal link, and we've been documenting this causal link. It is safe to assume that the impact of disinformation affected the Spanish-speaking electorate more directly and has contributed to changing voter patterns in South Florida. Now, why is this the case? Others on this panel have explained the conditions that contribute to the use of social media to spread misinformation about everything from candidates' positions on whatever issue to more recently the way in which COVID-19 has been characterized. In my view, and it's very important to understand two very basic realities about South Florida voters, especially Spanish-speaking voters. And it's truer here than in any other community in the United States. A recent poll that we conducted at the Latino Public Opinion Forum, which I have the privilege of directing at FIU, notes that Cuban, Colombian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan voters, right, decide on whether to vote or not for a candidate based on two conditions. Number one, his or her stance on U.S. policy toward their home country. And number two, the stance of the candidate on the conditions that prevail in the home country. These appear to be two very significant determinant conditions that are growing in influence, as we have documented in this very recent poll. The basic reality about four South Florida groups has contributed to the way in which mis and disinformation has spread with the objective of winning the votes of these communities. After all, in a sense, as Thomas Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local. And how do you make this community vote? By essentially catering to their innermost fears of what has happened in their country and what Washington might do with respect to their country. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it goes back at least to the early part of this century. Or as I was saying earlier to one of my colleagues, in the 1980s, disinformation about the spread of AIDS, for example, led President Reagan, in fact, to establish a kind of a truth commission. Well, here we are 30 years later, and we still have the very same story about how AIDS is being propagated by the U.S. government, targeting both African Americans and, of course, the LGBTQ community. Now, the appearance of social media platforms, of course, has intensified this. And YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, and others, as we know. But the pace has accelerated, especially in terms of the amount of disinformation available, but the extent to which it is mainstreamed. And I think this is the key, because it's not just that it's out there in social media. The issue, I think, is how much of this information has become mainstreamed. And what is this about mainstreaming that's so important? Because mainstreaming here in South Florida and nationally, and also in our countries back home in Latin America, it takes at least 5 distinct routes. Number one, local, state, federal, and public officials deny that there is a problem and do nothing, as I said at the very beginning. Number two, local, state, and federal, and public officials disseminate misinformation. They retweet, they cite, they embrace its content, and even use it extensively in campaign ads and in spots, etc. Number three, local, state, and federal public officials create their own misinformation. They make up stories that are often reproduced until it is difficult to tell the difference between fact and fiction. In other words, repeat a lie and repeat it enough until everybody believes that it's true. And fourth, and something that my colleagues have noted here, we mainstream it through media, through radio and television, right? And they reproduce this misinformation as real factual news. And this is coming from, not just local stations, but even international stations that are broadcast here to our community. Now, time constraints, of course, don't allow me to fully illustrate each of these, but let me just very, very quickly address the situation with Colombian voters in this community. Since at least 2016, Colombian voters have been bombarded with disinformation about the stance of Democratic candidates on U.S. policy toward Colombia and on that country's internal political situation. Often, they're cast as supporters of the Colombian left, even of the terrorist groups such as the FARC and the ELN. Democratic candidates have had a very difficult time avoiding accusations that they support policies that will turn power over in Colombia to these groups. At the same time, these groups are inundated with notions of alleged alliances by Democratic candidates with leftist candidates, when in fact no such endorsements exist. This exercise, however, was not only conducted by candidates for local, state, and U.S. congressional posts, but is also conducted by like-minded Colombian politicians who actively campaigned for them in South Florida. Now, it's not the first time that foreigners try to influence the course of U.S. politics, as we know, but it is probably the most visible and the most extreme version of a Latin American country attempting to influence U.S. political races. Now, moreover, disinformation about this issue was spread not only via translated versions of QAnon messages, for example, but in Colombia's social media platforms essentially created new material that was then reproduced via social media and then obviously mainstreamed. That pattern that prevailed in 2020 continues even as we speak. I invite you to tune in this afternoon to talk radio, to hear popular talk show hosts reproduce the same misinformation about vaccines, masks, socialism, and other conspiracies.
Thank you, Dr. Gamera. Very informative. Thank you. Mr. Patel, you are the final witness. You may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you to the Committee on House Administration for organizing this roundtable and for giving me this opportunity. I wanted to start off by addressing disinformation a little bit more broadly. So the first thing is we have to recognize that disinformation, whether it's about COVID or the upcoming elections, seeks to undermine trust individuals have in institutions. Even though disinformation may not be about the upcoming election, the disinformation itself has long-term consequences on individuals and their civic participation. People who are exposed to higher degrees of disinformation have deep doubts in institutions, believe institutions do not work for them. And so by simply addressing the issue of election-related disinformation will not fully address the problem. And so we really need to address disinformation in a broader sense and minimize the type of disinformation that is out there seeking to create doubt in institutions. Secondly, an individual's journey into accepting disinformation as information is oftentimes a spiral, beginning with an openness to one form of disinformation and then spiraling from that into various other forms. Most recently, we saw that in 2020 with COVID, where you had individuals who may have had legitimate doubts around the vaccine at the time and then went to search for information, but then were served so much disinformation on platforms that they began to see these platforms are providing them disinformation as reputable sources of information, and then sought out those platforms again when seeking out further information. So all of a sudden you had individuals who were looking up COVID-related disinformation and now are thinking their local mailman is throwing out Democratic ballots and voting by mail is not an effective way of voting. Furthermore, particularly this conversation, we have to understand that Latinos in this nation are much more at risk of disinformation than the general population. They're more likely to be exposed to disinformation. They spend twice as much more time on platforms like YouTube than non-Latinos. Two, they are more likely to share that disinformation, take information off, let's say, fringe Facebook pages, share that on closed groups. And three, they are more likely to not only consume and share that misinformation, but are more likely to use platforms that produce that information. The most dangerous part about this is young Latinos are twice as likely than the general population to use platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram, making disinformation a greater threat to them. Oftentimes when we anecdotally think about disinformation, we think about people who are older being more susceptible to disinformation, or people who might have a college degree. However, the data shows us that young Latinos are being exposed to disinformation at a much more higher rate than the general population. This started in 2020, where we did a poll in May of 2020 ahead of the general elections, and just half of Latino voters at the time said they knew how to vote by mail or had confidence in voting by mail. Going into the fall, we saw strategic disinformation campaigns aimed at reducing trust in voting processes on Spanish language platforms and English language platforms. right-wing negative actors began to see doubt in voting processes through false narrative and campaigns altering images depicting mail-in ballots being thrown out or local mailman throwing out ballots. Even, things like mail-in ballots being Xeroxed or election workers counting Democratic ballots multiple times. These false narratives started off on known conspiratorial Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, websites, and other social media platforms. They were quickly mirrored and propagated on Spanish language mediums. And what we do at Voto Latino is we try to run programming aimed at registering and turning out Latinos. And so in 2021, we partnered with our partners at Media Matters to create the Latino Anti-Disinformation Lab. And what that did was, one, dedicate more resources to Spanish language media monitoring, two, test methods to combat disinformation, and three, successfully scale programs that are successful at combating disinformation. The most important thing is the way to reduce disinformation campaigns is to stop the spread of them early on. The further a disinformation narrative takes hold, the harder it is to combat, and the messages that you use to combat that disinformation lose effectiveness over time. We're seeing that right now with COVID and taking the vaccine. We tested a bunch of videos in the summer of last year around COVID-related pro-vaccination videos, and we learned a lot of things. One of them was debunking disinformation head-on doesn't work. Getting doctors out there to say that the vaccine doesn't, you can take the vaccine while breastfeeding, or the vaccine doesn't lead to infertility, doesn't work. You have to use authentic messengers from the community, non-authoritative voices. And we've also learned that some of the learnings that we've learned from COVID-related communication cannot be applied universally going forward. In 2022, we're focused on identifying the topics of disinformation that have the largest effects on Latino voters. So disinformation that is dissuading Latinos from voting, disinformation that aims at persuading an individual to vote for one candidate over the other. And in terms of partisan choice, one of the things we know is that disinformation will always favor the candidate that is running against the system, anti-institutions, because that's what disinformation does. Disinformation creates doubt in trusting the system. And so what we need to do is, A, dedicate more resources to monitoring this disinformation, B, reduce the flow of disinformation, and C, what we're doing is creating ways to combat disinformation, but more importantly, inoculate people against disinformation before it becomes mainstream. Thank you.
That completes the statements of our witnesses, and we certainly thank each of you for your participation. It is now time for our members to ask questions. In hearings and roundtables like this is always the exciting part of any hearing, when the members can interact with our participants. And so we will start with Mr. Aguilar. Sir, you are allowed 5 minutes approximately.
Thank you, Mr.
More
Chairman.
or less.
Thank
More
you,
or
Mr.
less.
Chairman. The chairman's known to have a light gavel when it comes to our hearings. Mr. Chairman, I also want to just take a quick second and welcome our colleagues. You, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Lidra Fernandez and I serve on the Elections Subcommittee, which is why we are here within House Administration. But we're joined by two leaders in Congress on a lot of these issues as well. Members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is a very small committee in Congress, Mr. Chairman, that I know you're familiar with, but that has jurisdiction over just about everything. And these members, I believe, are also subcommittee members of the Telecommunications Committee, which is an interesting nexus given the conversations that we're having today. So to Mr. Soto, a Floridian, and Ms. Bedegan from Californian, also members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus leadership, as whip, as first vice chair, and Ms. Lidra Fernandez as a freshman representative. So we really have some impressive stars here in Congress who are helping to guide this conversation. Appreciate their willingness to join us here today, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mercado, I was really taken by some of your comments, and specifically, I've been doing a little bit of work, obviously, on these issues as a member of the January 6th committee, and you talk about the study from January 6th after. Was there anything that you researched or saw, or can you share things that you heard in the community from the period of November 4th, 2020, from Election Day to January 6th specifically, and to what extent radio stations, because that's what you had monitored, spread misinformation that led to supporting the big lie, which was basically the kindling for the rallies that took place across the country in December, that culminated in the rallies on January 5th and January 6th. Was there any information that you pulled up specific to that?
Thank you for the question, Representative Aguilar. As an organization, we've registered over 200,000 Floridians to vote over the last 10 years in African American and Latino communities. And we really see it as part of our mission and mandate to make sure that people are able to participate in our democracy and do a lot of education on how to vote by mail and how to use drop boxes, how to vote safely during the pandemic. And we're really distressed by the number of reports that we were receiving that people were being told disinformation about the elections, about voting by mail, when people there's, in the state of Florida, supervisors of elections have to receive that ballot by election day. And so anyone spreading news that they can put their ballot in the mail up to election day is extremely concerning to us. And we were seeing, falsehoods about how people can vote, spreading on social media and at times on radio outlets in a way that was very concerning to us. And so we had to do a lot of work to, as my colleague Amir Patel mentioned, to make sure that the integrity of our elections was protected and that people knew how to vote, where to vote, what time to vote. At times people even used the wrong date of the election. It was, and the number of reports that we were receiving from our members across the state was really one of the reasons why we decided to do a more comprehensive study, because we didn't have as many direct quotes or the actual clips from the radio program. But there are ways that, there were many journalists that were covering the vast disinformation that we were hearing from multiple sources.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the individuals who were targeted? Were they new voters targeted specifically with voter suppression tactics as a result of these efforts?
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize, Miami-Dade County, you have a majority Latino population, majority Spanish-speaking community, many voters, English is their second language, and they prefer to receive their news in Spanish. And I think that's why it's particularly concerning to us that there was so much disinformation in Spanish. And that's also true in Central Florida, where we do our work, where so many people came from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and are, learning about the politics of Florida, and to be at the receiving end of so much targeted disinformation was of great concern to us.
Thank you. Mr. Patel, you talked a little bit about half of Latinos in the U.S. using WhatsApp and two-thirds, according to research by Equus Labs, two-thirds of Latinos use YouTube to receive information, and these sites struggle to combat misinformation and disinformation on their platforms. What should the CEOs of these social media platforms, do to continue to tackle and address Spanish misinformation and disinformation that's prevalent on their platforms?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. There's been a lot written about this. However, I think the number one thing is dedicating more resources to identifying Spanish language disinformation, and there just simply are not enough right now. But there are a lot of minor fixes that can really, so to speak, slow down the spiral of disinformation. For instance, right now, if I were to go watch a video on YouTube around the vaccine, and I, found a video that, propagated falsehoods and false narratives around the vaccine, Once I finish that, the algorithm is gonna basically tell me, here are 10 other videos that you might also be interested in. And so that reinforcement of disinformation is incredibly, incredibly harmful because, people that are victims of disinformation, they're just like us. We look at information, we're like, okay, well, that's a one-off. But then if you start seeing repeated messages over time, you start believing, and you're like, okay, well, maybe that's not that crazy. So I think, removing content, dedicating more resources and employees to monitoring that content, improving the algorithm so people aren't exposed to disinformation as much are three, steps that any company should probably take. Aside from that, it's very platform specific, as you know. Facebook challenges versus Twitter versus Telegram, et cetera. But I think the number one thing that everyone's going to talk about is how do you reduce disinformation? You basically hire more people who are proficient in Spanish. You hire more people that have a say in how the algorithms basically promote videos, and you make those changes. And I think that those are things that, are contrary to basically engagement-based interactions that we all have on social media, where like social media sees that, oh, you're consuming this type of information, here's 20 other videos kind of like that. And I think that is right now, that reinforcement of disinformation is right now one of the most dangerous things. And on Facebook, you see that you join one group, they recommend you other groups. So you might also like this group. Being able to kind of, hamper down that sort of algorithm suggestions are also equally as important.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Next will be the gentlelady from the 3rd District of New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Pues muchísimas gracias y gracias por tenerme aquí por este tema. Realmente, what I found interesting is that in some horrible way, right, that Florida is becoming the incubator for misinformation in Spanish that then is exported not just to my state in New Mexico, but to other states. And Latinos are everywhere now, right? We have large percentages of Latinos across the United States. And we also know that they turned out in record numbers, right? We had 7 million more Latinos turn out in our 2020 election than the cycle before. And that's something that we should celebrate. But instead, what we have seen are efforts to suppress that. And I kind of want to follow on the theme of whether what we're seeing with this disinformation is harming our beloved community, is harming our Latino community, both in their ability to participate in our elections, as well as in their ability to protect themselves from the pandemic. And our public health is being threatened. So I kind of wanted to hit on that theme a little and ask you questions about that. Ms. Mercado and Mr. Patel, and I do want to hear from this side as well. Can you share with me how you think the information is spread, and especially that is spread in public broadcasting, on the radio, on the television, falls not as opinion on free speech, but rather as truly false information that is known to be false and known to be misleading? And what kind of negative impact are you seeing that's having on the on our communities?
Thank you, Representative Ledger Fernandez. For us, I think what we've seen is that people are experiencing as fact. And to use an example from social media, in English language, a post that's decrying vaccines and spreading misinformation and disinformation on COVID-19 will be taken down in a matter of days or will be flagged in a matter of days. In Spanish, that is not the case. Those videos that are done in Spanish with the same content that are getting flagged and taken down in English are not being flagged in Spanish. And oftentimes for weeks or even months, those videos continue to circulate. And I think that, the way that people are getting their news, whether it's on social media or on the radio and the television, I think we see the same thing to be true. where statements that have been debunked in English and have stopped circulating in English mainstream media. In Spanish language, that is not the case. It continues to these falsehoods continue to circulate, continue to build up an audience, and continue to undermine our democracy and trust in our electoral process.
Mr. Patel, maybe we can have you focus on the issue of voter turnout and the ability for people to accurately return their ballot to where it needs to go. And do you have any estimate of what level of suppression that might have caused?
Yeah, I think a few things. Like, one is we have to basically broaden our definition of disinformation. When people often think of disinformation, they think of, let's say, social media companies. They oftentimes define disinformation as like election day is November 20th, as opposed to like November 3rd or November 5th. Yes, that is verifiably false, and that is disinformation. However, there are other forms of disinformation that also have an impact on voter turnout, like voter depression. For example, when you look at right now all the disinformation around Vice President Harris that seeks to sow racial tension, that sort of disinformation within the Latino community basically creates voter depression, creates apathy amongst voters, like, oh, I'm not going to vote. And so, that sort of disinformation also has real-world electoral consequences. While we had unprecedented turnout in the Latino community last cycle, by most estimates, it was 51 to 54% of all eligible Latinos voted. For white Americans that are non-Hispanic, that number was 71%. So, while Latinos are the second largest voting bloc in the country right now, and we're seeing unprecedented gains in vote share, it's still nowhere near where we should expect it to be, and these disinformation campaigns that we're highlighting here are just going to further, mitigate voter turnout. Right now, within the Latino community, the group that is, as I highlighted earlier, most exposed to disinformation is young Latinos. That is also the group that is most at risk of not voting in this upcoming election. And so I think in sum, addressing disinformation more broadly than just verifiably false information saying election day is on Wednesday as opposed to Tuesday, or you can turn in your ballot tomorrow. We need to better grasp and define disinformation and hold individuals accountable for that disinformation, because all of that is having an impact on turnout, as you were saying.
And Mayor Martinez and Congresswoman Murkazal-Powell, since you know well what is happening in your own communities that you have represented, what kind of impact have you seen, and do you actually see a harm, a visible harm to these communities from the disinformation? Please share with us.
First of all, I have to differ a little bit from what they've said. In my own personal case, while I was on the radio, and since I started my own YouTube channel, I have never, ever put out any bad information about medicine. My doctor died, my mother's doctor died, my mother died of COVID-related, so I would be the last person. What happened to me a week ago, actually, I was suspended from the show because the show started getting attacked by people calling in or sending in information that I was giving medical misinformation. When we appealed, they immediately denied it. When we appealed, when they canceled, I was out for the whole week. Maybe I'll be back on today. I can assure you, I took the 2 programs, we transcribed it in Spanish, I'm having it translated in English, because I want to elevate that to a higher authority other than a computer or an algorithm or people that are attacking these programs that don't want me on the air, as they didn't want me on the radio station. And so I have the experience of they acted too quickly without reviewing that if I ever mention one of the medicines that all these hacks are talking about, talked about it on the negative way. And so they are not spending the amount of money necessary to really review it after somebody has flagged it. Because somehow, and probably Mr. Patel probably knows more about it than I do, and I'm new to the social media. I'm an old guy. I can tell you that there are hackers There are people that are being paid to attack specific channels. I know of mine. I've been suspended for a week. They told me that they will take me out. They're not going to silence me. I'll find a way with a megaphone. They're not going to silence me. But others might not have the resources that I have and be able to fight them off. And this is where Congress comes in and says, wait a minute, you're now canceling shows that have never spread any misinformation about medicine, but you're allowing others to run rampant. That's a major problem that we now have.
I want to make first a quick correction. I said that this was funded by the Koch brothers Libre. There are two Libres. I got confused. This was actually funded by Demetrio Perez Jr., and there's another organization, Libre Initiative, which is funded by the Koch brothers. I have seen a visible division in our community, a rise in mistrust in our election system. And I can tell you, I'll give you a couple of examples, especially when you're asking me about harm in our communities. I have been, for years, advocating gun safety and combating gun violence here in South Florida and across the country. And one of the things that I have been hearing on Spanish radio, which seems to be coordinated at a larger effort nationally as well, is the request to arm and get ready for what's coming if Donald Trump or Republicans lose their elections in 2022. I can tell you, Representative Fernandez, that I don't have the dates in front of me, but there was a week specifically where Representative Matt Gaetz was here in Florida asking people to go and get ammunition and get armed and get ready for the fight. And then that same week, I heard the same exact thing being repeated on Spanish radio. This is extremely dangerous. We have seen a rise in gun violence and crime here in Florida and across our country. Gun sales and ammunition have increased dramatically, exponentially in the past year. And so this is definitely an issue that is part of the disinformation and misinformation. We know that the NRA actually has written the playbook on misinformation.
Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to recognize my friend from Kissimmee, Florida. He is a veteran of the Florida State House and Florida State Senate.
Let's keep it.
My friend,
We're
Congressman
keeping with
Soto.
honesty here.
I looked up your bio while
Thank
we
you so
were
much.
waiting.
Mentiras sobre la elección 2020. Mentiras sobre las vacunas. Mentiras sobre 6 de enero. Hay proliferación en medios de comunicaciones en español en Florida y en otros estados. Y estas mentiras son contra el interés público, el estándar de la Comisión de Comunicaciones Federales. Nosotros tuvimos ya vistas en el Comité de Energía y Comercios sobre WhatsApp y otros medios sociales. Y hoy nosotros estamos aquí enfocando en la radio y otras habilidades para distribuir estas mentiras en español. Muchos de estos son abusos de mayores, quien está muy vulnerable a estas mentiras. También causa violencia con los Proud Boys de Miami. Y también nosotros estamos aquí para causar y escribir un reportaje a la Comisión de Comunicaciones Federales y el Departamento de Justicia sobre la evidencia nosotros escuchamos aquí. Y con más de 1 millón de puertorriqueños en la Florida, nosotros estamos en el lado de hispanos aquí en Miami, quien está recibiendo estas mentiras. Thank you so much to all of our witnesses for coming. First, I'd like to focus on our seniors. Congresswoman Mercado Powell, you mentioned your mother and how she had read that article. What is happening to some of our seniors here in their 70s and 80s who escaped from persecution in other countries like Cuba or Venezuela? Because I'm worried they're being brainwashed and then dying thinking there's a communist takeover coming. I mean, this is despicable stuff.
Yeah, it's extremely concerning to see that certain groups, right-wing extremist groups, are taking advantage of the pain and the suffering of the diaspora that came here to Miami, to the United States in the 50s, 60s, using the communist and the socialism fear tagline to confuse and to suppress the vote and causing fear in our communities. Like I said, it was my mother who prompted me to this insert in El Nuevo Herald, and the majority of the listeners to some of the radio stations that have been mentioned here are usually 65 years and older. What we just recently saw is, just last week it was reported, taking advantage of our more vulnerable populations, our older citizens whose primary language is Spanish, is that there is an organization right now that is changing the political affiliation of their voter registration ID from Democrat to Republican. That was reported on Channel 10 News by reporter journalist Glenna Milberg. And this is a perfect example of organizations that are taking advantage of older populations where their main language is Spanish to either disinform, divide, sow distrust, or now, most recently, an active effort to change their voter registration ID, which needs to be investigated. This is not only dangerous, what we're talking about here, but I think that we need to call it for what it is. A lot of these methods are unlawful, unconstitutional, and there needs to be some sort of oversight to prevent harm in our communities.
Well, we're here for oversight today. Mayor Martinez, there's been a deliberate silencing of your voice, a more progressive voice in Miami in Spanish. You mentioned being taken off the air from a local radio station and even false attacks on YouTube. What hypocritical irony, don't you think, when the people who are trying to silence you are trying to say we're censoring them? Can you give us a little more information on this, these blatant attempts to silence your viewpoint here in Miami?
Thank you very much, Congressman Soto. But before I do that, and I'm going to answer it in straight,
By all means.
I want to go back to what you mentioned about the Proud Boys. It just so happens that a few days I had to call the news director of Channel 51 because they ran a story about the Proud Boys, and they called it a fraternity. Never, ever saying that this is a terrorist organization. And when this was brought to their attention, the individual, which I'm going to talk about it in my show today, the individual, and I'll mention his name, said, I don't feel comfortable with calling them what they are, terrorist organization. That happened in Channel 51, and they know because I protested. Going back to quick history because of the timing, I never wanted to do a radio show, but I was asked to do a radio show in Caracol, and I did it for about 3.5 years. I did it through the elections, and it went extremely well. Well, I get a phone call on a morning and said, your program has been canceled. And I said, okay, can I say goodbye to the audience? This is an arrangement that we made. No, 45 seconds, I'm let go. What had happened that the day before, a gentleman by the name of Carlos Basayo, who's not a citizen, who's not a resident, who's got a visa that is questionable, and maybe Homeland Security needs to look into how did he get into this country from Spain during the lockdown. I've heard stories, but I don't know that much about it. And so what they did is they had put in an option to buy Radio Caracol. This is the day before. The next day, I'm let go in the morning. That same night, Mr. Basayo goes to the Channel 41, which is a station, and he says, I have bought Caracol. I have already made changes. The only change they made was my program. They have never bought Caracol. The FCC had not approved it. I understand from their own attorneys that this thing has been stalled. It's been 10 months. Now, again, where's the FCC? Why don't they look into the application? The application I got, full of lies. The owner is not an American citizen. There are fronts.
Well, Mr. Martinez, as you may know, CHC has already, several Energy and Commerce members have already filed a letter, including myself and Congresswoman Barragan, to object to that sale based upon censorship. I want to go into, lastly, to Ms. Mercado. Proud Boys come from here in Miami. They came up and violently tried to overthrow our Capitol. I was in the chamber at the time this happened. Many of them are being arrested as we speak. What were the kind of lies being said to motivate this kind of insurrection?
Thank you for raising that, Representative Soto. And during the election, we were very concerned because we were seeing Proud Boys surrounding and threatening pro-Biden Harris caravans in downtown Miami with impunity. We were seeing them being lifted up on the radio, on Spanish language media as a legitimate organization, as opposed to
A terrorist group.
a terrorist group that is spreading hate. And even even now on, you referenced Channel 51 on the anniversary of the insurrection. If you were to watch Spanish language television in Miami, you would be horrified because the coverage of January 6th here in Spanish language television in Miami was in defense of the Proud Boys, as opposed to really honoring the 5 people who lost their lives and honoring our democracy and demanding accountability from the people who committed horrendous acts at our U.S. Capitol and symbol of our democracy. So I think we continue to be very concerned about the Proud Boys not being held accountable for their actions and being lauded and celebrated. And we know that, when we give rein to hate speech, we witness violence. And we witness that in El Paso, the way that the attacks on immigrants resulted in the loss of many Latino lives. And we saw the results at the U.S. Capitol of when white supremacists are emboldened, and when hate speech is emboldened, it oftentimes leads to violence and people losing their lives. And really want to thank everyone, all of our elected officials who are defending democracy, because we are seeing very clear attacks on our democracy. And for many Latinos, like, we come here to the United States because we want to realize democracy, and we want a country that is advancing democracy and equity.
It's a shame that the same fascist techniques we saw in home countries that people fled are being attempted here in South Florida. We saw balanced coverage on January 6th in Central Florida in Spanish language. We know we can do better. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. At this time, the chair recognizes Ms. Barragan for 5 minutes, more or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for everybody who played a role today in putting this roundtable together. My mom is an immigrant, and I remember when I was a kid, we always had Spanish language television on. We had Spanish language radio, and there was such a reliance on Spanish radio and Spanish television. And one of the things that's been very sad for me to see is to see this misinformation and disinformation on these channels, and then have people in my community, where I represent a majority Latino Spanish-speaking community in Southern California, come to me and ask me, is this really true? We're hearing this stuff. And we have seen the impact just here in Florida and what it's doing. And when I got to Congress, I was always told that it's Spanish information that's focused on providing accurate information and services to our constituents, and they rely upon this information and the truth of it. So to see this at the heart of it is pretty disheartening. And I know the Congressional Hispanic Caucus has made this a priority, given its target on Latino communities and the harm it's having in our communities. And I know today's focus is on Spanish language. I happen to also sit on the Homeland Security Committee, and just last week we had a hearing in that committee, and I asked several experts and the witnesses there about increased spread of misinformation and disinformation in the context of domestic terrorism. And they all agreed that the problem has gotten much worse over the last several years, and unfortunately, it works in convincing those targeted to radicalize, and it has led to increased threats. to domestic terrorism and potential violence across this country. And that should be a concern of everybody across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. This is not a partisan issue. This is about making sure we're protecting our democracy. And that's why I think today is so important. Professor Gamara, thank you for your research and your work in an educational institution. And I know you have done a lot of work in the space of Latin American countries. And I just wanted to, ask you to maybe shed some light on Congress's role. We have, as a Congressional Hispanic Caucus, have asked, the social media platforms like the Twitters and the Facebooks, we've called for a meeting with them to hold them accountable because we want real action. But this also goes to Spanish media as well. Some of them are Univision owned, and that's remarkable to me. So your thoughts on our role, what we can do, and anything that you think maybe hasn't been said in some of the testimony today?
Running the risk of being a bit controversial, I think you as members of Congress need to specialize on this issue, and that's why this committee is important. But what I have seen just in monitoring some of the hearings, I was really struck, for example, by representatives in response to owners of these platforms saying, well, my son who's 14 knows more about computers than I do, and he does Instagram all the time and that kind of stuff. I think you need to start by specializing. Your staffs need to specialize on this very complex issue because it is something that everybody uses, yet there is so much technological sophistication that you need to be aware of. So that's number one. Number two, I think there is a real important task that all of us can undertake, and that includes us at the universities, those of you who are policymakers, those of you in NGOs and so on, and that is to raise awareness. This is probably the main task, to raise awareness about how crucial it is to fight disinformation. And in this sense, the most important thing is fact-checking, which we try to do constantly. Try to promote media literacy, frankly, because I don't want to appear as I'm bashing Hispanic media. I'm on Hispanic media quite a bit here, and I think that there is some very responsible journalism that is being done here in Florida, in Miami, by Hispanic stations. The problem is that there is a segment there that is completely dominated by these kinds of messages. So I do think that beyond raising awareness, beyond doing the technological stuff that in fact Amir knows more about, I think there have to be legal consequences, and legal consequences for those who purposely disseminate misinformation. What kinds of legal reforms need to be done? I think that's for somebody that's more in a legal field than myself. But I do think that the bottom line, Representative, is something that in fact all of my colleagues have mentioned. Disinformation has contributed to something that is now global, and it is the polarization of our societies. We are so deeply polarized, we hate each other, and disinformation, in fact, promotes hate, but most importantly, what it has done, and we've measured this, we have polls all over South America, all over Latin America, and in the United States. The decline of trust in political institutions, the decline of trust in you as members of Congress. In fact, there was a survey done where Congress had 9% public approval rating. That's lower than any Latin American legislature that I have measured over the last 30 years. So I think there needs to be a very significant effort into restoring trust in political institutions in this country.
Well, thank you. And I just want to follow up with my former colleague, Debbie Mercado. First of all, thank you for being a voice on this issue and for raising this issue and for being the eyes and ears for some of us who may not be able to listen to the what's happening on the radio here. And when I think about this issue, as I mentioned, my own mother, who would watch Spanish media and radio, tell us a little bit about, and given that I've served on Homeland, we've seen the influence from Russia, China, and the role that they have played in our elections, the misinformation that's put out there. What have we seen in Latin America, and how does that matter here as it relates to this outside influence?
Yeah, thank you, Representative Barragan. Look, when this was happening right before the November 2020 election, I asked the chairman at the time of the CHC, Joaquin Castro, Representative Castro, to join me in writing a letter to the FBI to request an investigation into the source and spread of this disinformation, understanding that we had enough evidence at the time where Russia had intervened in the 2016 election. Understanding that there are no borders in social media, what we have been watching, monitoring as part of the Global Americans group that actually received a grant from the State Department is that China and Russia have been involved in spreading disinformation in Latin America. And organically or not, that information is also penetrating our Latino communities here in South Florida. Like Professor Gamarra said, local politics is, or what happens in home countries, the political systems that happen in home countries affects directly our Hispanic communities, our diasporas here. We've seen just in the past 10 years, a large number of Venezuelans, Colombians who have moved here to South America. So they trust the news sources in their home countries, but not really understanding that some of those sources are actually coming from China, Russia, bad foreign actors that are trying to, again, sow mistrust in democratic institutions. We have seen also concerning tweets, WhatsApp reports from Venezuela, Cuba, and this is definitely affecting the systems here, social, economic, political, in not only South Florida. This is larger than Miami and South Florida. This is really trying to understand and study what is happening at a larger international effort in this coordination that is coming and penetrating specifically our Hispanic community. So my request to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, to House Admin, is to follow up with the FBI because they never really provided a briefing on our request. We followed up twice, Representative Castro and I, and they were not able to provide a briefing. I think it's incredibly important to get a briefing from the FBI on what they're seeing. Where is this coming from? Who is funding and who's coordinating the spread of disinformation, specifically targeting vulnerable immigrant communities? Here in South Florida, it's a Hispanic community, but we're seeing it targeting Vietnamese American communities, Chinese American communities, Indian American communities. We have to understand where this coordination is coming from.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, you said it right at the outset in your opening remarks, and you said it twice, and I wrote it down. To this people believe the lie that this election was stolen. And us Latinos, we spend so much time online and listening to Spanish language that's why I think it's so critical that you came down here and was willing to hold this roundtable here, that we have to continue to combat this because it's a national security issue and our democracy is at stake. So thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. And thank you so much, all of you, for your testimonies, and thank you for your questions. I guess I am the last to speak today. All of you talked about your immigrant backgrounds, and I, too, have an immigrant background that I don't talk about very much. It's so much different from your backgrounds, but nonetheless, it is an immigrant background. My father, who was George Kenneth Butterfield Sr., for whom I was named, left Bermuda, island of Bermuda, in 1917, a black man in Bermuda, and migrated to, guess where he came? First, he went to New York City, found his sister looking for a job, and she couldn't help him. And then he landed in Ocala, Florida, looking for a job. His uncle, for whom he was named, Uncle George, was probably the most prominent African-American in the whole state of Florida. You can look him up. His name was George Giles. He was there in Ocala, but for some reason, Uncle George, could not find a job for my father. And so Dad came to where? Miami, Florida. also looking for a job. We had relatives over in Opelika and Miami Gardens and 23rd Street here in Miami, and couldn't find a job here in Miami. So what did he do? He volunteered for the war, World War I. And he fought in the war for 2 years. He was discharged and came back to Ocala, and then he enrolled in college and later dental school and became a very prominent dentist in North Carolina. And so I too have an immigrant background, but it is somewhat different from the stories that I've heard today. I heard Mayor Martinez talk about history, and he and I are the oldest ones here in the room. He was born in 1949. I was born in 1947. And so I guess the older you get, the more you become concerned about history. And so, you know, when I think of history here in South Florida, there are many parallels to the history that we experienced in eastern North Carolina. We were southern states. We ceded from the Union, you know, after the Civil War, you know, began in 1861. So there are a lot of parallels. But here in Florida, when slavery ended in December of 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, there were some, I looked it up, some 187,000 people in the whole state of Florida, 187,000. And 44% of those were African American. There were only 2 members of Congress, Darren, in the whole state of Florida. One of those became an African American congressman. His name was Josiah Walls, and he was from the Tallahassee area, and he was the congressman during Reconstruction, and so there was a lot of history. The documents show that 2/3 of African American voters in Florida voted during Reconstruction. Only the men voted because women were disenfranchised, black and white. But a large number of African American men were registering and voting here in Florida all the way up to 1900. But then Florida enacted a literacy test and a poll tax, and African Americans in Florida were disenfranchised. And I call that the nuclear option. The Klan couldn't stop them, and other methods weren't working, and so the only way to make it work was for the Florida House and Senate to enact a literacy test and a poll tax, and that literally disenfranchised thousands of African American males here in the state of Florida. But as the years went on, there was not much political participation from African Americans in Florida. The thrust was on education. Mary McLeod Bethune, others. The thrust was on education here in Florida, and it worked. But finally, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was enacted by the Congress of the United States, and the Voting Rights Act has been a very powerful law in our country. First of all, it eliminated the literacy test, thank God. Most of the southern states had enacted literacy tests at the turn of the century, and so the Voting Rights Act eliminated the literacy test as a pre-qualification for voting. It also enacted, Nanette, Section 2, that you and Teresa and all of us know about Section 2. It empowered not just African American communities, but minority communities all across the country to be able to litigate any grievances they have about election systems or practices in their communities. And Section 2 is very powerful. Before that, I was a voting rights attorney in North Carolina, and we litigated. We litigated voting systems under Section 2, and we brought all of them down. The Jingles case, for example, I was involved in the Jingles case and others. One of the leading cases, it's just dawning upon me now, was Escambia County. Is there an Escambia County in Florida? Pensacola. There was also a leading case out of Pensacola years ago on voting rights. And so we've used the Voting Rights Act in a very powerful way. But the final piece of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5. Section 5 singled out certain states for what we call pre-clearance. Before you can enact and enforce any laws with respect to voting, because of your past history of discrimination, you must get it pre-cleared by the U.S. Department of Justice or by a judicial panel in Washington, D.C. And so Section 5 also was very helpful in the voting rights movement in the South. But you know what? In 2013, the court in Shelby County versus Holder invalidated Section 4, not Section 5, invalidated Section 4, which is the formula that determines which jurisdictions are subject to preclearance that are contained in Section 5. The Supreme Court specifically said that Section 5 continues to be the law of the land, just cannot be enforced because of the absence of a formula. And so because of that, because of no Section 5, not just southern jurisdictions all across the country have enacted voting laws that are very, very discriminatory. And so we call those second generation barriers to voting. Well, what you are talking about today is what I'm going to refer to as a third generation barrier to voting. It is misinformation, disinformation, and I'm going to inject a new term into the discussion, malinformation. And that is the dissemination of information that is technically correct, but it is out of context. So we have misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And so I would encourage us to talk about those three forms of incorrect communication. And so I'm delighted to see all of you today. I'm delighted to be able to say these few words to you. We take our job very seriously. Those of us who sit at this end of the table, we take this very seriously. And this is our passion, and this is one of many callings that we have in Congress. I'm going to be leaving the Congress at the end of this term, but I'm not going to leave the fight. And so to those